Today we're going to learn how to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. Now last time we had roots, we had radicals, and we learned how to get rid of radicals by squaring them. And today we're going to do just the opposite. And we have a square. And how do we get rid of that square? We're going to use a radical to get rid of that square. So we had a parenthesis that was squared, and to get rid of that square we're going to root it. We're going to put a square root around that, and whatever we do to the left hand side we're going to do to the right hand side. And so the square root of a square is itself. So we're going to take the root away and the square away, and we're going to be left with x plus 5. And the square root of 18 is going to become plus or minus the square root of 18. We won't get into all the reasons for that, but that is what happens. And so let's isolate that x. And x is going to equal negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 18. Now that's plus or minus the square root of 18 because whenever you have a square, you usually have two answers. Not always, but you usually have two answers. And 18, let's break that apart and see if we can simplify that. Yeah, 18 is 2 times 3 times 3, so let's grab those twins and take them outside. That's good, and our answer is going to be x equals negative 5 plus or minus 3 times the square root of 2. Now that's plus or minus 3 times the square root of 2 mean you're going to have two different answers. And both of them are going to be negative 5, but one of them is going to be plus 3 root 2, and one of them is going to be minus 3 root 2. But that's our answer, unless you wanted to write negative 5 plus 3 root 2 and negative 5 minus 3 root 2. But either way you do it is fine. Most people do it plus or minus. And let's do, well, it's hard to see why we did what we just did until you see how we complete the square. And so we're going to do a problem now with a quadratic equation where we're going to solve it by completing the square. And then all of this is going to make a lot more sense. This probably looks really familiar, and we used to solve this by factoring. Well, factoring is really great if you have ordinary numbers, whole numbers, that is to say, counting numbers, and we don't have that here. And if you tear apart the 12, you're going to see that we're never going to get to negative 8, that is to say negative 8x. And so the way we solve this is we solve it by completing the square. And the way we do that is we move the negative 12 to the other side. Watch this very carefully, and you're probably going to have to watch this 2 or 3 times. But I'm going to add a number here so that this is a square. And it's not real clear right now what that number that I'm going to add to make this a square. And whatever number I add here, I'm going to add here. Now careful, I do this different than Mr. Wallace. As a matter of fact, I do this different than anybody I've seen before. It's similar to what everybody else does, but I kind of skip this step and we're going to circle back to it. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to bring these two down and we're going to turn them into a square. And the way we turn this into a square is we bring x squared down here and just make it x. Square it. And it's in the parentheses with a negative 4. Now where do we get the negative 4? We cut the negative 8 in half. That's how we do this. Okay, so if we cut the negative 8x in half, you can see that when we square this, it's going to become x squared minus 8x plus 16. 16, where did we get that? Well, negative 4 times negative 4 squared. Now I know I'm doing all this in my head, and if you do this on paper, this may make a lot more sense, okay? But this is how squares work, and we worked with squares before, and that's why I'm kind of skipping that step of writing all this out. But what about the 16? Well, that's the number. I told you I was going to add a number there. And that's the number I'm going to add. If I'm going to square this, it's going to be this. But I never squared the 4. And when I square the 4, it's going to be 16. Positive 16. And that's the square that I was promising you. That's why I left that space blank. And when you reduce it to a parentheses, it's x minus 4 parentheses squared. And that gives us this. And as you can see, as we move along, this is how we solve it by completing the square. Now what did I do? I did add 16 to this side, so you better add 16 to that side. And by the way, the number that we add over here is always going to be positive. Why? Because if this is positive, then a positive times a positive is a positive. If it's a negative, like it is, then negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16. So this number is always going to be positive. And again, we added 16 to this side, so you better add 16 to that side. And we brought this square down, and that's the square. And 12 plus 16 is 28. And you can see I did a couple of things. Number one, I didn't bring all this straight down. You can see the equal sign. I always like to bring stuff straight down. But if I do, it's going to be bumping me in the head. So I'm going to just scoot it over just a little bit. Not too much, but just a little bit. And the other thing is you can see that we're jumping all over the place. Normally, what we've done in the past is we do all of this work up here, bring it down, do all of this work here, and everything we've ever done is line by line. And by the way, every book I've ever read on completing the square does it that way. They do it line by line. I just think this is a little bit easier. If you want to do it line by line, then this is what you do. You take the negative 8, divide it by 2, and square it. Well, negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. Square it, and that gives you 16. Brought 16 over here, bring 16 over there. You can do it that way. That's the way most people do it. I think that's a little bit more confusing. I shouldn't say it's more confusing. I just think that this is a little bit more understandable. But you got to remember that as you start squaring this stuff, go back up here to the first line and complete all that work. So, how are we going to get rid of this square? Well, we just did that in the previous problem, and that's why you probably looked at the previous problem and you go, why are we solving this that way? Well, this is why. Is because we're going to have a parentheses squared, and how are we going to get rid of it? Put a square root around it, and whatever we do to this side, we have to do to this side. And this side gets a plus or a minus. And again, we're not going to go into why that's true. It's just true. And let's see. The square root of a square is itself, that is everything that's inside the parentheses. So we can get rid of that. Good, and we're going to bring that negative 4 to the other side, and it's going to become positive 4. And x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 28. Good. Now, you didn't pull apart the 28. Always pull apart your roots. Okay, maybe there's something we can do and maybe there's something that we can't do. But always pull it apart, because guess what? This answer is incorrect because it has not been simplified. So always pull your roots apart. And oh my goodness, we have twins. Let's pull those 2's out. And we have 2 root 7. Now I would recommend to you that you circle the twins and bring them out like we always have. I'm just skipping that step because we've already done it about 25 times. So I'm gonna skip that step. I hope that you don't. But x is going to equal 4 plus or minus 2 root 7. And that's the answer. And you can see that if we had tried to solve that quadratic equation by factoring, do you think you would have ever guessed that? Come on, you know you would have never guessed that. And so that's why we solve by completing the square. Completing the square isn't the only way to solve a quadratic equation. We've done that by factoring. Now we've done it by completing the square. And we can also do it by using the quadratic formula, which we haven't got into yet, but believe you me, we are. I think that's the next lesson. But let's try one more of these that's a little bit more complicated. Well, this isn't too bad. It's certainly not as bad as it looks. I know that to complete the square, x squared needs to be 1. That is, it needs a coefficient of 1. So how are we going to solve this? We are going to divide everything by 2. And that's going to be x squared. That's going to be 10x. And that is going to be 24. Okay, that's much more reasonable. And let's bring this 24 over to the other side. Remember, we can only have 2 numbers over here because we're going to cut the 10 in half. But let's bring the 24 over to the right-hand side of the equation. And of course, positive 24 is going to become negative 24. And we left 2 spaces for the numbers that we're going to add later. And we're going to turn x squared into x, and we're going to cut 10 in half. And that will be x plus 5 squared. And that will equal, we don't know, because we haven't completed this up here. And so we cut our 10 in half, and that becomes 5. And again, if you multiply that binomial out, that binomial times that binomial, that is to say x plus 5 times x plus 5, you're going to see that it's x squared plus 10x plus 25. Okay, that's good. We went in reverse order again. We squared this first, and then we squared that. And we added 25 to this side, which means, of course, we've added 25 to that side. And so we brought all of this down. If you bring all that down, you're going to see that it equals that. And negative 24 plus 25 equals positive 1. And we're going to get rid of that square by rooting it. And whatever we do to the left-hand side, we do to the right-hand side, and that's plus or minus the square root of 1. The square root of 1? What's the square root of 1? Well, the square root of 1 is 1. And so we have x plus 5 equals plus or minus 1. Bring that positive 5 over and make it negative 5. And that's not going to be our answer because, well, guess what? We have counting numbers. That is, we have numbers we can add. I can't really add 5 plus the square root of 7. And so we don't do that. Like in the previous couple of problems, we had some counting number plus or minus some root. But we don't have that. And so we can add negative 5 to plus or minus 1. And that will be our 2 answers, negative 4 and negative 6. Now let's try something else. Well, this seems pretty simple, except that in this problem we're going to get into fractions. and I know how much you hate fractions. So let's just do this the way that we've done it before. Let's bring that -2 to the other side. And of course, -2 is going to be +2. So let's bring the x squared and the -3 down. And like I warned you, we're going to get into fractions. -3 divided by 2 is -3/2. Please put -3/2. Do this as a fraction. Do not do this as 1.5. Do not do this as 1.5. And you're going to see why as we go along. Maybe you won't see why, but I'll just, spoiler alert. If you do it any other way than this, that is 3/2, you're going to get into trouble. And so we have x minus 3/2 and all of that squared. And so to square out this up here, we're going to have to square 3/2. How do we do that? Well, we square the 3 and we square the 2. So if you square this out and you're not too horrible with fractions, you'll see that you end up with this. And again, please leave it as 9/4. Do not do something like 2 1/4 or some decimal. You're going to get into trouble doing that. So we're going to add the +2 and the +9/4, and that will become 17/4. I kind of promised you wouldn't like this. Anyway, we're going to get rid of it the same way. Let's root both of those. And we're going to have the square root of a square. There's nothing new there. And we're going to have plus or minus the root of a fraction. And let's simplify that a little bit. We're going to tear this off. Nothing new there. And here, when we have a fraction in a square root, we change this to the square root of 17 over the square root of 4. And that's not that hard, but let's do that. And I think you can see that that's going to be easy to solve. The square root of 4 is 2. If you want me to break that up into 2 times 2, grab the twins, take them out, we can do that. But I don't know, the square root of 4 is pretty simple. That's going to be 2. And that worked out real nice because you're not allowed to have a root on the bottom. It's one of the rules of algebra. We're not going to get into it too much in Algebra 1. And had that been the case, that we would have had a problem, that is something that wasn't a square in that root. I would have done a different problem. We're not going to get into that because that's really Algebra 2. But just so you know, again, for the SAT, ACT, ASVAB, and again, I don't know if this is on those tests, I'm just telling you this is something that you should know. It is against the rules to have a root on the bottom. That is the root in the denominator. The denominator is supposed to have a counting number. That is a non-root number. And we're just not going to get into that in Algebra 1. But it is important to know. Okay, so we have root 17/2, which is good. And it's actually plus or minus root 17/2. And let's bring that -3/2 over. And that will become +3/2. And there you go. X equals +3/2, that is 3/2, plus or minus root 17/2. And that's our answer. And that's the end of this lesson. I bet you're glad it's the end of this lesson. And do your homework.